Spotlight. Now, this is a bit of a different one. And it's somewhat pertinent because we've talked a lot about companies, about the for-profit sector. What we haven't talked about is another major sector of the economy, and that's looking at charities. Now, what I've got with me at the moment is a bottle of water. Most of you probably can't see it. It's a bottle of thank you water, and I bought it because I forgot my water bottle today and I'm thirsty. I could say I've also bought it because I'm a good bloke, because as part of this, one bottle, so what I bought, buys 1 month's worth of safe water provided to someone in need. They give me a tracking number. I can go onto their website and find out what's been done with it. What's interesting about it, and I did a little bit of research about the company behind this, there's actually not a lot of information about dollars and cents. Now, we've talked about Woolies, and how many of you guys check Woolies' annual report before you go do your grocery shopping? I'd hope probably none of you. I'd be kind of worried if anyone did. But the same with charities. I get mates hitting me up all the time, especially now it's got really popular if you're doing the City to Surf or if you're doing a marathon, or if you any one of these events. My sister's doing Oxfam, she's hit me up for money. And, being a good bloke, I'll throw a certain amount of money into each one of them. You've got to sort of, I don't even know what charities they're involved in. Someone just says, I'm doing this, or throw in 25, 50 bucks, whatever it happens to be. I don't even think where that money is going. But if you think about that for a second, we're spending money, and I'm hoping, imagine some of you guys, if not most of you guys, give money to charity in some way, shape, or form. Often we don't think about what the charity actually does with the money. It's not an investment decision, but it's not dissimilar. We are spending money on something, hopefully to have a good impact, and we don't really know what happens to it. The question is, should we? Now, keeping with the Rugby League theme for the day, and I'm not picking on this guy just because this is just something that I came across. The poor Dragons. Anyone know who that is? It's not exactly the greatest of photos. Anyway, so that's Luke Priddis. He's been retired for a little while now. But this is an article from back in 2009. So he was interviewed by government investigators at that time as part of an audit of compliance and accountability as part of his charitable foundation. So the Office of Liquor, Gaming and Racing, I don't know what they're doing with charities, but anyway. The Office of Liquor, Gaming and Racing is auditing all facets of the Luke Priddis Foundation, which has raised more than $540,000 in the past 3 years, but has distributed less than 10% of that. Now, there may be very legitimate reasons why he's done this, and I haven't seen the outcome of that investigation, but there may be completely legitimate reasons why you've collected all that money and none of it, or very, very little of it, has gone out to people that actually use it. And so what I just want to focus on is something which is in the US, which is a not-for-profit itself, but it's a not-for-profit which looks at giving you information about what your charities do. So this is an organization called Charity Navigator, and what it does is it works to guide intelligent giving. By guiding intelligent giving, we aim to advance a more efficient and responsive philanthropic marketplace in which givers and the charities they support work in tandem to overcome our nation's and the world's most persistent challenges. It's giving you information to make decisions with. That is no different than what we're looking at with companies. Is this an issue that we should be looking at? Absolutely, and we're going to see a few more stats as to why this is the case. And this information we will be putting up online. So, this charity's obviously had some problems over the last couple of years. But what they basically do, and we don't look at the measures of how they do it, but they look at what their financials are like and what their accountability is like. And the Livestrong Foundation actually scores pretty well. Not in the best section, but it doesn't do too badly. And what they look at is what they spend their money on. So for Livestrong, the amount of money that they receive and actually spend on the things which they say they're going to spend it on, it's over 80%. So every dollar that you give to them, over 80 cents of that is actually going to the things that they said they're going to do, not to the CEO, not to sort of marketing or all those various other things. They actually do a pretty good job in that respect. And that, for me, if I was going to give to Livestrong, that is something useful to know, because it helps you figure out, is it going to the right places? On the other side of the idea, and that links, it looks better up on the screen than it does on my computer. The reality is the 50 worst charities in the US raised more than $1.3 billion. And of that $1.3 billion, the charities that they basically work with received less than 4% of that. That's nothing. So every $10 you give to them, actually I'll use $1 because that's going to work out hard for me. Every dollar that you give to them, less than 4 cents goes to what they say they're going to do. I'd like to know who those charities are, because I would absolutely not give anything more to them because of those sort of findings. And unless we have that information, you don't know if your money's being used wisely. On the flip side, how much these guys are getting paid, and this was a big story when I was over in the UK last year. Huge amount of charities are being paid, and the guys in charge are being paid large amounts of money to run these charities, even if donations are dropping, even if they're not giving as much to the charities that they or the work that they're doing. They're getting large amounts of money. So why are these organizations any different to the companies that we invest in? I mean, I'd like to know what they're doing. In Australia, we don't have a system when we can check that as readily as what they have in the US. We were going to have a system. It was the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, which was going to get set up. It was set up by the previous government. It has now been defunded. So we don't actually have a situation where we can really tell and get easy information. So I know it's not in the general sphere of what we normally talk about here, but I think it's something quite useful to think about is, if you do give to charity, does it actually go to where you think the money is going to? So, regulation 101. We have to have a cash flow statement because we're told to. So that's easy enough. And it even talks about what information it provides users. So if you look at paragraph 111, so right in the back there, it provides users of financial statements with a basis to assess the ability of the entity to generate cash and cash equivalents and the needs of the entity to utilize those cash flows. This last bit then becomes important. 107 sets out the requirements for presentation and disclosure. Those are the key things that we're interested in with cash flows, because apart from figuring out what cash and cash equivalents are, it's not accounting choices being made. It is just literally how we present that information and what you see of it. And so that's what we'll be having a look at. And I want to show you two examples. And obviously you guys have got them in front of you right at the moment. But what option A and option B do is provide exactly the same information. There's nothing different that's being provided there. So customer receipts, new loans, sale of property, plant and equipment, interest payments, share buybacks, payments to suppliers. It is a set of information provided. Same set of information, just set out differently. Customer receipts, payments to suppliers, interest payment, that set of cash flows, there's a $10,000 inflow in total. Sale of property, plant and equipment, there's a $450,000 outflow. Inflow, it's a sale, not a purchase. We borrowed $250,000 and there's been a share buyback, so there's been $50,000 outflow in terms of that set of cash flows. It breaks it down. And it's been broken down in a particular way, but I hope what you guys are picking up on is that's an easier way to figure out certain aspects of the company. We can see kind of just how generally the company operates, what it's getting from customers and what it's paying to suppliers. We see that. We see that a lot of its cash flow is actually being driven by selling property, plant and equipment. That's not sustainable. You can't just keep flogging stuff off and expect to keep running your business, because after some point in time, everything is being sold. So yes, they're cash flow positive, but that is being driven by sale of non-current assets. And so that's a different set of cash flows than your operating cash flows. And there's been some money flowing out in terms of their financing cash flows. So in a nutshell, and we'll go into the details of this in a moment, option B is what we have. This is the way the AASB 107 requires the presentation to happen. And if that means that every company has to use the same method of presentation, it is way easier for us to compare across those companies. Much easier. And as someone who has been through this process not that long ago, some of you may have gone through this process recently, but if you think about some common decisions that we have to make in everyday life about complex transactions, the two that come to mind where it's really hard to compare between different types of products, one are mobile phone plans, and two is private health insurance. You probably, maybe you're a bit young for the private health insurance idea. Certainly I've had to change it. I've changed my plan at the start of this year. And I just kept putting it off because to compare what we were currently on with the different options of which are out there, it was just mind-boggling the different choices available because each health insurance provider has slightly different things and does it in a slightly different way, and there's slightly different benefits and there's slightly different limits, and it's like, Christ, this is all too much. When information is not provided in a systematic fashion, it's much harder to make those decisions because you then have to figure out what the commonalities are. What 107 is basically doing is just cutting out all those differences and saying, company A has to use this method, company B has to use the same method, company C has to use the same method, company D has to use the same method. They all use the same thing. So when we look up what their operating cash flows are, we've got a good sense that this is a comparison with the second company, with the third company, with the fourth company, and so on. It makes it easier for us to decide between those different companies. Definition of cash. It's not a major issue, but we do need to have a look at it because there's cash equivalents. There's classification of cash flows, and that's a key aspect of 107. What's an operating, what is a financing, what is an investing cash flow, and how we disclose and present that information. So 107. Cash and cash equivalents. What cash equivalents are defined in paragraph 6. And I'll just read it out because I don't think I've got it on the slides. Might have it on the slides. A short-term, highly liquid investments that are readily convertible to known amounts of cash and which are subject to an insignificant risk of changes in value. When we think about cash, we often think about that sort of thing. I don't know if any of you guys came across this. This was a raid on a Mexican drug baron, and they found 18 billion, well actually no, it turned out to be $22 billion in cash in his house. It was ridiculous. I mean, I don't know what you're going to do with that amount of money. They just had it stored in bookshelves, and obviously it's not his anymore. So they're short-term commitments, they're readily convertible into cash, and they have an insignificant risk of value change. So if you look at paragraphs 7 to 9, they actually talk about it in a little bit more detail. What we mostly think of cash is when you've got cash at the bank. So, money. But it actually doesn't talk about cash being money. It talks about things which are easily convertible into cash, which tends to suggest there are things which are not cash, which can get included as cash. Insignificant risk of value change. Now, that means you've got to be able, so a house is obviously not cash because yes, you can convert it into cash, but it's going to take some time. The value of that property is going to change. But there might be some really short-term instruments which you can convert really quickly and which actually don't have much risk attached to them. But even thinking about cash for a moment, what happens if the cash that you hold is in an economy which is hyperinflationary and inflation is going through the roof and the value of that currency is just dropping really, really quickly? Would that still be counted as cash? I don't know. So just because it's cash doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get included as cash and cash equivalents. Now that's going beyond the scope of what we're doing in this class today, but it's something to be aware of. That's all right. what it also does is it excludes movements between those items. So if you're changing a cash equivalent into cash, that's not a cash flow. You're just changing those between items. So that gets excluded from it. Definitions, we're looking at operating, investing, and financing activities. And I think at this point, I know it's still relatively early on, but I think at this point we'll take a break. We'll come back, we'll look at how we deal with operating, investing, financing activities, and we'll look at the practical example. A few comments about some admin things about exams and next week and the bonus assignment, and that will do us for the day. So we'll take 4 or 5 minutes and we'll get into the next section.